Can China and the U.S. mend their troubled relations? America's top diplomat flew to Beijing aiming to ease months of tension. But with both sides increasingly at odds over many issues, what are the chances of success for Antony Blinken? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. When superpowers fall out, the rest of the world worries about what might happen next. So the visit to China by America's top diplomat is being closely watched. The military and economic giants failed to see eye to eye on many vital issues. There's rivalry and mistrust on both sides. But there's also acknowledgement, however hesitant perhaps, that these strategic rivals need one another to further their own interests, both at home and abroad. So will Antony Blinken's visit signal an improvement or further fuel divisions? We'll explore the issues with our guests in a moment, but first, this report by Katia Lopez-Hodoyan.
By most accounts, relations between the U.S. and China are at an all-time low. There's hope this visit to Beijing by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will change that. Expectations for the two-day trip are low, but it may pave the way for more constructive meetings between Presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping.
I'll be meeting with Xi again and talking about legitimate differences we have, but also how there's areas we can get along.
There hasn't been much common ground lately. There's tensions over Taiwan, territorial disputes in the South China Sea, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and trade sanctions. China's perceived strategy of using its economic might as political leverage abroad is also alarming Washington and its allies.
I think the U.S. probably needs to make some assurances to China that it supports the status quo on Taiwan. It benefits no one for that to be upended, I think. Some sense that it's not against China growing economically, it just has areas of competition.
The U.S. recently reported aggressive maneuvers by a Chinese fighter pilot near an American military spy plane over the South China Sea. And a Chinese warship came close to a collision with a U.S. destroyer in the Taiwan Strait. Back in February, a suspected Chinese spy balloon was detected flying over the U.S. Blinken's trip is looking to set up systems to avoid similar incidents. China has repeatedly called on the U.S. to not interfere in its sovereignty or domestic affairs. The world's top two economies seem to be at odds now over a growing list of issues.
I would like to emphasize once again that the U.S. should not fantasize about dealing with China based on its position of power. China and the U.S. must develop the relationship on the basis of mutual respect and equality.
Blinken is the highest-level U.S. official to visit China in 5 years. Now governments across the world are waiting to see if the visit will lead to any concrete results. Katia Lopez-Hodoyan for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and meet our guests. In Beijing is Einar Tangen, China Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute. That's a Chinese geopolitical think tank. In Colchester, in England, is Natahsa Lindstaedt, Deputy Dean and Professor at the University of Essex. Natahsa focuses on U.S. policy and foreign affairs. And in China's commercial capital, Shanghai, is Joseph Mahoney, Professor of Politics and International Relations at East China Normal University. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Joseph, let me start with you today. Expectations for this visit by Antony Blinken to Beijing are low. But how significant is it that the visit is happening, and could it actually help mend the relationship between China and the U.S.?
You know, at the end of the G7, Biden teased that a thaw in China-U.S. relations might be coming. Recently, Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen offered what some viewed as conciliatory remarks against decoupling and the importance of continuing to advance trade between the two countries. Now, with Blinken's visit, some are hopeful that we might be witnessing the thaw that Biden predicted. The most, I think, optimistic analysis anticipates this meeting perhaps will be followed by several others throughout the summer, including Yellen Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, and Special Envoy for the Climate, John Kerry. Now, some are being, I think, a little overly optimistic that this might lead to a summit between the two presidents, President Xi and President Biden, later this year. But more importantly, that this will signal that relations are stabilizing and finding a new normal. However, I think given all the damage that we've seen over the past 2 years, given the difficult political and economic situation that is still unfolding in the United States, and given the fact that many anti-China initiatives won't simply disappear, but more likely deepen, it's prudent to keep expectations low, as both Blinken and Beijing have signaled. And I think, recalling the ridiculous balloon brouhaha that canceled Blinken's previous visit, perhaps we should all be satisfied that he's simply shown up this time. This alone marks progress.
Natahsa, you heard Joseph there talk about the fact that there are now some expectations out there, perhaps overly optimistic, that this could, down the line, lead perhaps to a meeting or a summit between Presidents Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. Do you believe that that could happen anytime soon?
I don't see it happening anytime soon. I do think, and I'll agree with what's already been said, that this is an initial positive first step, just the fact that they are actually meeting and that Blinken did show up. There are some potential avenues of cooperation. I mean, both countries do $600 billion in trade with one another. The U.S. is China's biggest trading partner, and China is the U.S.'s third biggest trading partner. And though there have been all these different tariffs that were applied during the Trump administration and that have been maintained under Biden and have gotten worse, they're still doing a lot of trade with one another. In fact, it even went up if you take into account the cost of if you don't take into account the cost of living crisis. But there's so much mutual suspicion that remains. There's so many different points where they, it could be quite dangerous to speak on it, because there are all kinds of issues that have been unresolved. The issue of Ukraine, the issue of Taiwan, the issue of China's, the U.S.'s recent application of tariffs on semiconductors going to or blocking of semiconductors going to China. And so because there are so many pressure points and different issues, it makes it very difficult to just resolve things. But I think what Blinken was trying to have in mind with this visit was to start the wheels of communication going, advocate for the U.S.'s interest and the allies' interest, and try to take that first step in diffusing some of the tensions.
Einar, you heard Natahsa there talk about the fact that despite all this heated rhetoric about the low point in the relationship between China and the U.S., we still do see very robust trade ties between Beijing and Washington. So I want to ask you, despite the tough diplomatic relationship, the economic relationship is still strong, right?
Well, strong is a strong word. What you have is necessity. The fact is that China produces a lot of the intermediate goods that the United States needs. Also, at a time when the economics are in disarray in the U.S., facing a lot of multiple issues, $17 trillion in private debt, $32 trillion in climbing of national debt. Of course, people are selecting the least costly. There's a trade-off between, what they want in terms of quality or brand and the actual price and what they can afford, especially with basically wages for the lowest going down every month due to inflation. So it's not a question of they want to trade with each other. It's a question of necessity. So this idea that, somehow Washington is doing China a favor by trading with it is nonsense. The economies are very much interconnected. And what I see here is the U.S. Coming to China and saying, listen, you have to listen to us. And, it's this kind of colonial attitude that we're going to set the agenda and you should be reacting to it. Now, we saw in Anchorage years ago that China is no longer content to just be slapped around and then be told to shake hands afterwards. So at this juncture, Blinken has to do more than just kind of come and say, look, you should be listening to us. He has to put something on the table. The best thing would be to start lifting a lot of these, blacklists and trade sanctions.
Einar, let me ask you something else. The fact is, no matter how the visit by Blinken is perceived or described. You've had the U.S. business community that has been welcomed with open arms in China. Take the recent example of Bill Gates. What does that tell us with regard to China prioritizing business and trade?
Well, China's trying very hard to put it out there that they're open for business. And American and also European heads of companies, everything from Starbucks to Volkswagen, Elon Musk, are going there trying to signal to their governments that China is a very important market for them and they can't afford to lose it. Imagine, we've already seen the memory chip maker, Micron, to lose $15 billion in sales. That's not a drop in the bucket. So, these types of things are affecting business. Business is sending a signal to their elites that business and the politics are not in alignment. Thanks. Now, Gates is a little bit different. He does not represent Microsoft anymore, and he made a rather substantial $50 million investment, or no, I should say donation, to making sure that food security and drug delivery were going to be eased in China. So a little bit different. I don't see him necessarily a businessman, but he was certainly welcomed because he was trying to do something that encouraged a comity between these two nations at a time when it's at a very low point.
Joseph, so it's already come up even in this discussion that the U.S. and China are also locked in a battle over technology. The U.S. has imposed sanctions and export controls on major Chinese manufacturing and technology sectors. Beijing says that Washington is stifling Chinese competition. How does this get resolved? How do they work around this particular issue during this visit?
Let's just add a simple example. I was talking with a German colleague a few days ago, and he was saying that a lot of the European governments are simply following in the U.S. wake on this chips legislation, on this tech decoupling aspect. But Volkswagen is screaming, "How are we going to produce cars if we don't have chips?" Volkswagen is making a lot of their money in China right now, and they won't have access to chips either. Even European manufacturers in China are being closed out. So this is a major issue. I don't think that Blinken is in a position to negotiate anything related to chips substantially. It is a law at this point. I think what we're really optimistic for, if anything, is relaxing some of the tariffs. There's been study after study showing that these have hurt American consumers. Janet Yellen has said this on a number of occasions herself. But for whatever reason, the Biden administration has not been able to do what's best for the relationship or the American people. It hasn't had the courage to move forward with dropping some of those policies that are clearly feeding some of the inflation that American consumers have had to face. But, I think the real issue here is not just the trade, not just the sanctions on, for example, the defense minister, which prevented that meeting at the Shangri-La session in Singapore. It is the thing that's really worrisome to most of us. I know Einar in Beijing has the same concern. These close encounters in the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. The U.S. is bringing heavy military presence, expanding nuclear arsenals in Asia, expanding troops in the Philippines, admitting that they have troops in Taipei. All of these things, this is what's really pushing the button. This is what's really pushing us into the red. And these are the things that Blinken can talk about, perhaps resolving, or at least trying to back off a little bit. I don't know that he has the courage to do that, but that's what is really first and foremost in Beijing's mind.
Natahsa, Mr. Blinken has said that he wants to create a crisis management mechanism with China. What would that look like? What does that mean? Are we talking about reestablishing military-to-military communications?
Yeah, it's just more about increasing transparency so that you don't get these incidents like happened in February with the spy balloon incident, and things get, blown out of proportion. And from the Chinese side, they felt like it was more much ado about nothing. And because there wasn't really very good communication during that period. And so that's one of the things that is really important is establishing the type of transparency that prevents spiraling mistrust, and then where you start to see different states engaging in almost like a game of chicken, where they're pursuing stronger military postures that look more and more offensive, and then that spirals into something more than what they would want. Obviously, from the U.S. point of view, the last thing it wants is greater tension with China, and I think Blinken is trying to do that. But as has already been illustrated, a lot of the moves that the U.S. has done has just exacerbated these tensions. I already mentioned the fact that Trump had put $300 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese goods, and China then retaliated with another $100 billion. But that was a point where the Biden administration could have changed a direction there and reduce some of these tariffs. And that would be, of course, really important to improving tensions all around, including on some of the more volatile issues where there is mutual perception, both on the U.S. side and the Chinese side, that there's increasing aggressiveness, assertiveness in terms of what the sphere of influence is for both countries.
Einar, it looked to me like you wanted to jump in, so I'm going to let you do that. But I also want to ask you about the idea that Antony Blinken wants to essentially reestablish military-to-military communications between the U.S. and China. Is this something that can happen at this juncture?
Sure, and they had an opportunity, as Joseph pointed out, in Singapore. All they needed to do was withdraw the name of the current defense minister off the blacklist. Remember, he was put on that blacklist just because he was the person in charge of buying weapons from Russia, not recently, but many, many years ago. It's kind of nonsensical. China has been buying jet engines and also missile systems from Russia for a long time. For some unknown reason, the previous president decided that he wanted to put a black mark on this guy's record, and he can't, go to the U.S. So just drop that, and I'm sure that there would be some meetings. They've already acquiesced to this idea of beating Raimondo, who's not very favorable to China, and also, obviously they do like the climate issues, and also they'll be meeting with Janet Yellen, who they think is speaking a lot of sense. So they're being very wide in terms of their signals, but they cannot have a situation where they, the defense minister is being blacklisted. The reason I was smiling is because this idea that Blinken was coming to China is not correct. He 2 days before, he had not gotten an invitation. The reason I know that is I've talked to the diplomatic community here, and when there is an official invitation, it's published so that all the embassies know about it. There was nothing on the calendar, and it was an issue of some note among the diplomatic community. So 2 days before, he didn't get an invitation and already told people that he was going to China. All of a sudden they discovered this spy balloon, just like when he was coming this time. All of a sudden they discovered that there's spying going on by China and Cuba. Both were overblown. I think in many people's minds, it was an opportunity to try to seize the agenda and hold it hostage with some sort of claim that China's spying. We all know that the U.S. has $90 billion a year it spends on spying, and that's what we see. And quite frankly, there are 32 U-2 spy planes and additional ones, 11,000 drones running across the world at all times. And they are, in fact, spying. So this idea that somehow a low-level balloon is somehow a violation of America's sovereignty when it goes routinely over friend, foe, and neighbor alike on a daily basis gathering information is just an example of the hypocrisy and one of the reasons it's very hard for these two countries to deal with each other.
Natahsa, China is looking for assurances from the U.S. that it won't meddle in domestic affairs and that it won't cross a red line in Taiwan. At this stage, do you think that the U.S. would be willing to give assurances of that nature?
No, and I think we've seen that through some of the actions of the U.S., that there have been visits by Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House, to Taiwan before, and there are definitely elements within the U.S. Congress that are highly sympathetic to Taiwan, that want to offer even more support for Taiwan, that feel that Taiwan is a democracy and has supported human rights better, that are very critical of the human rights record in China and critical of the policies of the past from the Bill Clinton era onwards of comprehensive engagement with China, and would like to see the U.S. take an even tougher stance. So the U.S. has elements both in some business sectors, some elements in the Congress that don't want to make these type of assurances, because actually the U.S. has said that if China were to attack Taiwan, that they would have to come to Taiwan's defense.
Joseph, China's neighbors in particular are growing more concerned that the relationship between the U.S. and China has gotten so bad that it is in danger of perhaps spiraling out of control into some type of open conflict going forward. Are there any players within the international community that can help de-escalate these tensions?
You know, that's a good question. I think that there was some optimism that that maybe we were seeing something like that from French President Macron after he came here and made some very interesting comments. He came and visited, traveled around the country, visited the business communities in different parts of China. And this was you know, really out of step with some of the other things that we were seeing and hearing from Europe. Schultz came here, of course. He was one of the first to sort of break ranks. But again, what I'm hearing from a lot of European colleagues is that, in fact, there is no real difference among European heads of states. They are pretty much lockstep with United States at this point, and even because they're not sure how to implement things like chips, they're being even more robust in terms of how they're doing it. You know, I have a theory. I suspect that if we can see China making significant headway on the peace proposal that they put forward with Ukraine, and I think that President Putin is going to honor his relationship with Xi Jinping and help that along, that we might see President Putin in turn fulfilling something that he's teased in the past, which is negotiating or mediating between India and China. Now, I hear from a lot of Indian diplomats that New Delhi would like to see a deal put in place. And of course, this is interesting because from the American perspective, from the so-called Indo-Pacific concept, India would be one of the key strategic linchpins of that entire containment strategy. So if we can see India pulling out, remaining neutral, if we can see Russia playing a significant role in negotiating that, if we can keep in mind that India is receiving a lot of investment, a lot of machinery, and increasingly has the opportunity for business with China, then that may be something that really changes the dynamic. And I think that if India becomes a lot friendlier with China, that would put an interesting amount of pressure on Japan. Japan has a close relationship with India. And in turn, that could have a ripple effect on other countries in East Asia, like South Korea and even perhaps Australia and Taiwan.
Einar, let me get your viewpoint when it comes to Taiwan. If China expects the U.S. to make an assurance to China that it supports the status quo when it comes to Taiwan, and if the U.S. does not do that, where does that leave things?
Well, Biden has already done that a number of times, especially after he walks back his statements that he would militarily intervene if Taiwan was attacked. You know, the U.S. accepted through the three communiques, late 70s, early 80s, that Taiwan was part of China. They just said, please do it quietly, peacefully, you know, but they didn't say you can't use weapons or anything like this, a war. China does not want to force a reunification. What they want, they regard Taiwan as part of China. You don't like to attack yourself. They're simply trying to keep foreign meddling out of it, especially that one when it's being encouraged by the United States. They know that this is all a card that is being used as part of the containment strategy to divert attention by the Chinese government from the economy to, you know, obviously preparing for the military. Remember, If China was not a success, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The U.S. sees China as an existential threat because of its economic progress. So all of the things that we're talking about are simply strategies by the U.S. to contain and put China in its place, the same way they did with Japan back in the 80s through the Plaza Accord. China's not going to accept that. So there has to be a new kind of understanding.
Natahsa, whatever ends up happening, the fact that this visit is actually going ahead, is this in some way an acknowledgement, however hesitant it may be, that the strategic rivals, that the U.S. and China, need one another in order to further their own interests both at home and abroad? Is that essentially the message that we're getting out of all this?
Yes, definitely. And as I've already mentioned, their economies are compatible in many ways. They, export and import huge amounts of goods with one another. This is something that has been going on now for decades, and it's deeply entrenched, and it affects all aspects of the economy and the global economy. So there are a lot of points for cooperation. It's just this issue of growing mistrust that has taken place, and people can assign blame on whoever they want. But from the U.S.'s perspective, they see China growing more assertive and aggressive on the world stage, and being more suspicious of its own actions. I'm sure China would have the same to say to the U.S. So this is an initial hope to thaw the relationship a little bit and focus on areas of potential cooperation. But I don't see any major waves taking place. Just the fact that they're meeting is a good thing, of course, because improved communication is always better than nothing, but we're not likely to see any major changes.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the discussion there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Einar Tangen, Natahsa Lindstaedt, and Joseph Mahoney. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.